150 men marched into enemy territory. They were outnumbered 10-1. The woods around them could have hidden 1,000 warriors ready to strike. And here's the insane part. They didn't just survive. They obliterated their enemies so completely that Native American forces would never recover in that region. Not once, not ever. You're probably thinking this sounds like some Revolutionary War battle you learned about in school. But no, this happened 100 years before America even existed as a nation. And the man who led this impossible victory? He wasn't some noble general or celebrated hero. He was a former pirate who captured slaves for a living. A man so violent, so ruthless, that even his own allies were terrified of him. This is Samuel Moseley. He's standing in a Massachusetts forest in September 1675, covered in blood that isn't his own, while around him lie the bodies of warriors from the most feared Native American confederation in New England. Whilst in his 40s, this former Caribbean buccaneer has just delivered colonial America's first decisive military victory in what would become the bloodiest war per capita in American history. A war where 10% of all male colonists would die, where entire towns would be erased from existence, where the very survival of English settlement in America hung by a thread. And boy, did Moseley enjoy every violent second of it. But how does a pirate hunting Spanish gold in Jamaica end up commanding colonial militia in the forests of New England? How does a man known for capturing African slaves become the architect of Native American defeat? The truth behind this story is even crazier than you'd imagine. Because what happened at the Battle of Hatfield wasn't just a military victory. It was the moment that showed European colonists they could actually win against indigenous forces who knew the land better, fought more skillfully, and had every tactical advantage. Little did anyone know that this single battle would set the template for 200 years of American expansion. Welcome to the insane true story of Samuel Moseley and the forgotten battle that changed American history forever. Samuel Moseley wasn't born a killer. He was born in 1641 in Braintree, Massachusetts, into a respectable Puritan family. His father was a church deacon. His mother taught him to read the Bible. You'd think this religious upbringing would create a moral, godly man. But here's the crucial part. Young Samuel learned early that in colonial America, violence wasn't just accepted, it was rewarded. When he was just 8 years old, he watched his town militia return from raids against local Native American villages, their horses loaded with plunder, their faces beaming with pride. The minister blessed them from the pulpit. It was an early lesson for Samuel that God, apparently, smiled upon those who killed heathens. But Samuel didn't want to be a farmer or a minister. You see, Moseley realized that real power came from controlling violence, not avoiding it. So, whilst his brothers tended fields, he practiced with muskets. While they studied scripture, he studied war. By his 20s, he'd made a decision that would have horrified his religious parents. He sailed to Jamaica to become a privateer, basically a legal pirate working for the English government against Spanish ships. And this is where Moseley discovered his true talent. He wasn't just good at violence, he was exceptional at it. Within 3 years, he commanded his own ship. Within 5, he'd captured dozens of Spanish vessels. But here's what really matters. During these years in the Caribbean, Moseley developed a philosophy that would later terrify New England. He believed that non-Christians weren't fully human, that they had no souls, that killing them was no different than slaughtering animals. He would later reflect on this and say it made everything so much simpler. No guilt, no hesitation, just efficiency. In 1670, something changed. Moseley captured a Spanish ship carrying something more valuable than gold, intelligence about slave trading routes on the African coast. Using these new connections, he transitioned from piracy to slavery, capturing and selling hundreds of Africans to Caribbean plantations. He made a fortune. But in 1674, at the height of his wealth and power, Moseley suddenly returned to Massachusetts. Why? The official records say he came back to settle down and invest his money. The truth is, he was running from something, or someone. Letters from Jamaica suggest he'd made powerful enemies, that certain Spanish nobles wanted him dead. So Moseley came home, bought land, married a respectable woman, and tried to play the part of a retired gentleman. He must have thought his fighting days were over. He was wrong. In June 1675, everything in New England changed. A Native American confederation, led by a chief the English called King Philip, launched coordinated attacks across the region. Within weeks, 12 towns were burning. Hundreds of colonists were dead. The English settlements that had seemed so permanent, so inevitable, were suddenly facing extinction. And here's where Samuel Moseley saw an opportunity. You see, the colonial militia was getting slaughtered. They were farmers and merchants trying to fight like European soldiers, marching in formation through forests where every tree could hide an enemy warrior. They were dying by the dozens. But Moseley? He knew how to fight dirty. He knew how to inspire terror. Using his reputation and connections, he convinced the Massachusetts government to give him an independent command. Not regular militia, but a company of volunteers, rough men, former sailors, ex-convicts, the kind of people respectable Puritans usually avoided. In many ways, it was such an incredibly simple move, but it was the meticulous planning that made it possible. While other captains recruited from church congregations, Moseley recruited from taverns and docks. While they trained their men to march in formation, he trained his to fight like the pirates and slavers they were. No rules, no mercy. But Moseley's real genius was psychological. He understood that King Philip's warriors had one huge advantage. They terrified the colonists. These weren't European soldiers fighting by gentlemen's rules. They would appear from nowhere, strike with devastating efficiency, then vanish into forests they'd known since childhood. The colonists were paralyzed by fear. So Moseley decided, if he couldn't eliminate their fear, he'd redirect it. Make the Native Americans fear him more. And that's exactly what he did. His first raids were deliberately brutal. When his company captured enemy warriors, he didn't just kill them. He mutilated the bodies and left them where other Native Americans would find them. When they took prisoners, Moseley would execute them publicly in the most horrific ways possible. Other colonial captains were horrified. Ministers wrote letters condemning his methods. But here's the thing. It worked. For the first time since the war began, Native American scouts started avoiding certain areas where Moseley operated. Word spread through both colonial and native communities. There was a new kind of English fighter, one who didn't follow any rules, one who enjoyed the killing. By September 1675, when the colonial government needed someone to defend the crucial town of Hatfield, they knew exactly who to send. Hatfield represented everything the English were fighting for. It was a prosperous farming community in the Connecticut River Valley, surrounded by fertile fields that fed half of Massachusetts. If Hatfield fell, the food supply would collapse, and with it, potentially the entire colonial project. But here's what made it a death trap. The town was completely isolated, surrounded by dense forests perfect for ambush, with the nearest reinforcements a day's march away. King Philip's forces had been watching Hatfield for weeks. They knew exactly how many soldiers defended it. They knew the patrol schedules. They knew that on September 1st, 1675, most of the militia would be in the fields helping with the harvest. What they didn't know was that Samuel Moseley and his company of 150 cutthroats had arrived the night before, hidden in barns throughout the town. When 700 Native American warriors emerged from the forest that morning, they expected to face maybe 50 frightened farmers with muskets. Instead, they ran directly into Moseley's trap. But here's the crucial part that most historians completely miss. Moseley didn't defend the town. That's what the enemy expected. Instead, he let them enter. Let them think they were winning. Let them spread out to loot houses and barns. And then, when they were separated and disorganized, he struck. His men didn't fight like colonial militia. They fought like pirates boarding a ship, close quarters, brutal, using knives and hatchets as much as muskets. They knew that Native American warriors, deadly as they were in forest warfare, weren't prepared for European-style close combat brutality. The battle became a slaughter. What people didn't realize was that Moseley had spent the previous night positioning his men in very specific buildings, not the obvious defensive positions, but in seemingly unimportant structures that gave them perfect killing fields once the enemy entered the town. He'd studied how Native American forces typically attacked settlements, always from the forest side, always focusing first on the meeting house and garrison. So he left those buildings nearly empty, turning them into bait. The real defensive force was hidden in workshops and barns that the attackers would pass by, thinking them unimportant. When Moseley gave the signal, a single musket shot from the church tower, 150 men opened fire simultaneously. From windows and doorways the enemy had already passed. In 30 seconds, over 100 warriors were down. The rest found themselves trapped between buildings full of armed men and open fields where they'd be perfect targets. But Moseley wasn't finished. As the surviving warriors retreated toward the forest, they discovered he'd positioned men there too. Former pirates who'd spent years fighting in jungles, not so different from New England's woods. The retreat became another massacre. Contemporary accounts describe warriors throwing down weapons and trying to surrender, only to be shot or hacked down anyway. By noon, it was over. Of the 700 attackers, at least 200 were dead. English losses: 9 wounded, not a single death. Moseley now had something no English commander had achieved since the war began: a decisive, overwhelming victory. More importantly, he'd shown that European colonists could not just defend against Native American forces, but destroy them utterly. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Word spread through Native American communities that there was a new kind of English fighter, one who fought without rules or mercy. For the first time, it was the indigenous forces who were afraid. But victory came with a cost. Samuel Moseley had developed a taste for killing. What began as brutal pragmatism, a means to survive, became something darker. After Hatfield, he stopped distinguishing between hostile and friendly Native Americans. To him, they were all the same. All enemies. All animals to be hunted. When Christian Native Americans, who'd been allied with the English for decades, came to trade or seek protection, Moseley would find excuses to arrest them, then execute them on fabricated charges. He once hanged 3 Native American women for allegedly signaling to enemy forces, despite multiple colonists testifying to their innocence. But the colonial government didn't stop him. How could they? He was winning. However, back in Boston, ministers were starting to ask questions. Letters from other military commanders described Moseley's company as more savage than the savages themselves. One minister who visited Moseley's camp wrote that his men decorated their tents with scalps and body parts, that they tortured prisoners for entertainment, that Moseley himself seemed to take pleasure in personally executing captives. The Massachusetts General Court received petition after petition demanding Moseley be reined in, but then King Philip's forces would attack another town, and suddenly everyone forgot their moral qualms. They needed Moseley. They needed his savagery. Little did Moseley know that his very success was creating enemies among his own people. Other military commanders, jealous of his fame and disturbed by his methods, began writing letters to London, describing him as a threat to Christian civilization itself. They pointed out that his company included former pirates and criminals, that he ignored orders from superior officers, that he was creating his own private army loyal only to him. Then, in March 1676, everything changed. Moseley received intelligence about a large Native American camp near the frozen Pawtucket River. Without waiting for orders or backup, he led his company on what he promised would be their greatest victory yet. But the intelligence was wrong. It wasn't an enemy camp. It was a group of Christian Native Americans who'd been allied with the English since the 1640s. By the time Moseley realized his mistake, his men had already opened fire. 43 Native Americans were dead, including women and children. For the first time, Even Moseley's supporters couldn't defend him. The massacre was too public, too obvious, too impossible to justify. The colonial government now faced a crisis. If they punished Moseley, they'd lose their most effective military commander while the war still raged. If they didn't, they'd lose all credibility with their Native American allies, whose support they desperately needed. In the end, they chose a middle path that satisfied no one. Moseley was officially censured, but not arrested. His independent command was dissolved. His men were dispersed to other units. He was given a regular militia position, under the command of officers who despised him. For Moseley, it was worse than execution. He'd gone from the colony's most feared warrior to just another captain, taking orders from men he considered cowards. The war ended a few months later with King Philip's death, but Moseley played no part in that victory. He spent the final battles relegated to garrison duty, watching other men claim the glory he believed was his. Ultimately, though, the people who suffered most were the Native Americans of New England. What is clear is that the Battle of Hatfield was an example of how European military brutality could be devastatingly effective against indigenous forces, when combined with tactical innovation. The methods Moseley pioneered, the use of irregular forces, psychological warfare, and the deliberate targeting of non-combatants to break enemy morale, would become standard practice in American frontier warfare for the next 2 centuries. Every Indian war that followed carried echoes of Hatfield. Reports suggest that, towards the end, Moseley had gone from a pragmatic killer using violence as a tool to a man who genuinely enjoyed inflicting suffering. He died in 1680, just 4 years after his disgrace, possibly by suicide, though officially from illness. He left behind a fortune in land and goods, but no children to inherit it. His wife remarried within 6 months, to a minister who publicly preached against the evils of violence. But Moseley's true legacy wasn't his wealth, or even his victories. It was the template he created. He showed that in America, the rules of European warfare didn't apply. That brutality worked. That terror was a weapon. That treating enemies as less than human made killing them easier. These lessons would be learned and relearned as America expanded westward, always at the expense of indigenous peoples, who found themselves facing not soldiers following rules of war, but killers following Moseley's example. The Battle of Hatfield is barely remembered today, overshadowed by more famous conflicts. But perhaps that's fitting. America has always been uncomfortable acknowledging that its expansion wasn't just achieved through superior technology or manifest destiny, but through men like Samuel Moseley, who were willing to do things that would horrify us today. Men who saw violence not as a necessary evil, but as a useful tool, or worse, as something to be enjoyed. Now, whilst the story of Samuel Moseley is pretty shocking, I still wouldn't call him the most brutal military commander in early American history. For that, you're going to want to check out the absolutely insane story of John Chivington, a Methodist preacher who became a colonel and orchestrated a massacre so horrific that even hardened soldiers under his command tried to stop him. We're talking about a man who displayed body parts as trophies and somehow still got defended by newspapers. It makes Moseley look tame by comparison. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers!